click record. Okay, it's being recorded. We will record all our sessions. You will reach them for a year from this site. And at the end of the session, please complete the session survey. Dr. Hutzell, the stage is yours.
Okay, great. This session is designed to emulate sessions that we had over the years at the World Congress when we met in Dallas. And this particular session was never a formal session. It was always informal and at the poolside when other things were going on. So, Vicki, tell us about those sessions.
Those sessions arose from my need after my strokes. I found noise and crowds very overwhelming, and the poolside was one place we could go and get away from some of the noise and confusion of having lots of people around. And we would just go out there and sit and relax, and people would come out and join us and ask questions about history of the organization and people we knew. And that's pretty much how the sessions went.
Okay, I'm trying to get it so I can see something on our screen. But yeah, during those sessions, actually, we went out to the pool the reason we went there is because the only place you could smoke cigars was at the pool. And so we would go out, one of us would smoke cigars and the other one generally declined. And then people would wander in and wander out, and they would just ask various kinds of questions about the philosophy or about how long we had been around, which is like forever at that point. When we started out, we were the youngsters, and the older people took care of us very, very well. We had two children, Daisy and Jilly, who always came with us, and usually there weren't other children there. So they kind of took care of Daisy and Jilly. So over time, the people got older and people weren't around anymore because they started out much older than us, and eventually they all passed. And so we moved from the youngsters to being kind of the oldsters. And so people would hang around and ask questions about what we thought and what we'd experienced. And they would come and they would go. So that's what the old sessions were. And that's kind of what this is designed to be, is something along those lines. And I would say things, and people often had comments, suggestions, differences, what have you. So for this session, though, we had to give 3 educational objectives. So I want to throw in the objectives so that we be sure and meet the objectives. The first one that we said we were going to do was provide an uncomplicated definition of logotherapy. You know, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been with psychologists that they absolutely love to complicate everything. And I don't. I like to keep things simple. You know, I remember we used to have poker games once a month with my psychologist colleagues, and they would complicate the poker games. I would call straight poker games, but they would complicate them to the degree that at the end of a hand of poker, there would be a pile of money, not big money because it was quarter limit, but a pile of quarters in the middle of the table, and everybody had played their hand, and we'd lay down our hands, and the question would be, now, who won? because you've made the rules so complicated, we don't know who's even going to win this hand. Well, I always try to do the opposite. One year, our interns, we had psychology interns train at our VA facility where I work. One year, our interns gave us, each staff member, a t-shirt with a saying on them that they thought about each of the supervisors at the internship training program. And the t-shirt they gave me said on the front of it, "Keep it simple and make it work." And I thought, that really fits. And I'm glad that they figured that out, that I was the one that tried to keep things simple. So toward that end, I loved it when Viktor Frankl gave his definition more than once of logotherapy in very simple terms. Surface the underlying value system to let it have its direction-giving effect, and then let it reside back into the noetic unconscious. That's it. Surface the underlying value system to let it have its direction-giving effect. So for me, that's the least complicated definition of logotherapy, and I've used that definition throughout my career. Objective number 2 was an explanation and reference of one method of individual application of logotherapy. Individual application of logotherapy. Again, trying to keep it very simple. One of my applications of logotherapy right now is my list. Many of us have lists. We call them honeydew lists. In many cases, we call them to-do lists. I have always had my own list, which is my meaningful opportunities list. Now, sometimes items on there look like items on somebody else's honeydew list because you want to keep the other people in the house happy, and that's a value. So I have my list that I keep these opportunities on, and it's pretty simple. This is my today's list. Actually, it covers about 3 days. I use a color each day, and I have these items on here that if I do them, I will find them fulfilling the meaning of the moment. And many of them fulfill the meaning of the moment that then adds up to other meanings of the moment, and then adds up to larger meanings as we go on. So each night I take a look at my list after I've gone through the day and marked off everything that I've got done from my list and added new items to the list. And if I've got several of these items marked off, I'm able to say, yeah, it was a pretty meaningful day. If I don't have my list, I kind of forget what I did during the day. But if I have my list, it's right there. So I look at my list and say, oh yeah, that's kind of good. Because every day, that's one of my first tasks in the morning is to look at my list and say, what were the things I thought I would find meaningful to do today? Now, overnight, some things change, situations occur, you need to make some adjustments. But as I look across the list, there are parts that move up and parts that move down on that list. And I said in the objectives that I would give references for these items. And a reference for that, actually it's in press. It isn't coming out yet, but it's in the Logotherapy and Existential Analysis Proceedings of the Viktor Frankl Institute, Vienna. And it should come out later this year or maybe next year. I just heard the other day that journal, that's the Vienna journal, should be coming out before too long. So you'll be able to see that there. So over the years, I had a larger to-do list form that I used with clients and patients and had them do this same kind of thing. And many of them found it particularly useful, as have I. Now, another simple kind of activity or application of logotherapy that I do, I've started since I retired. And it comes from a Frankl quote that I'm going to read from The Unheard Cry for Meaning. His quote is, "Usually, to be sure, people see only the stubble field of transitoriness." Okay, so he's talking about transitoriness, and as you get older, you start to think about that more than when you're younger. When you're younger, you're going to live forever. But as you get older, you start thinking, maybe not. So here he's talking about that idea. So usually, to be sure, people see only the stubble field of transitoriness. They do not see the full granaries into which they have brought in the harvest of their lives. The deeds done, the words created, the loves loved, the sufferings courageously gone through. So taking that quote, I'm thinking, well, I should be paying attention to the full granaries more than the stubble fields of transitoriness. Now, how might I do that? Well, I've always been interested in writing. And so when I retired in September of 2012, I joined a writing group in September of 2012. And my work in that writing group has evolved into writing stories about the past. So paying attention to those full granaries of the past. Now, the bulk of not the bulk, but more than half of those, I'm writing stories about when Vicki and I lived in the southern part of the United States. So that was 1971 to 1976. I've written stories about other things. Many of you know she's had a couple of strokes, so I've written stories about that. And I've written a number of stories that have to do with logotherapy. The idea in writing these stories, well, the working title for this overall group of stories is Stories I Might Tell to My Grandkids. So the idea is I'm writing these for my grandkids to eventually read, thinking we've done a lot of things that no one would know about if we didn't write them down. And it's meaningful to me to write them down and what they were about and why they were meaningful and experiences and learnings that we had. Well, those things are also interesting to several other people. So they're really written with my grandkids in mind, but there's other family members and they find them interesting. None of them were in the South with us when we lived there. None of them were here in the house when Vicki's had her strokes. So these go out to family members. There's a number of people in the stories that are still alive. There are a number that aren't because this was 50 years ago. So we've made contact with those persons and I send them the stories also. Most of them get all of the stories, but some of them get just the stories that they are in. Kind of decide who might find the whole thing interesting and who might just find a little bit interesting. So in that process, we have continued to interact with some friends that have been with us for 50 years, and we have regained some relationship with other friends who we have lost contact with, other than to send them the annual holiday greeting. So there's been a lot of payoffs, and a number of people have received these stories. The intent there wasn't to publish these stories, but rather to review the full granaries and make this information available to people who might find it interesting. One of the thoughts I always have is, I wish my parents or grandparents had done something like this so that I could read their stories. So that's always rewarding and meets a number of my personally meaningful values. And of course, Vicki and I have to discuss what we did and go through that again and try and remember what it was and what it was like and come to an agreement on the facts and details. So again, these stories were not intended for publication, but when I retired, I said, I'm not going to write anything for publication. But as time evolved, I said, okay, if a publication opportunity kind of walks into the room and says, do you have something you could write about this? And if I've already written about it, and I've already written to the point that I think it's done, because I'm a real slow writer and it takes me several years to consider a story done, then I will submit that, because the opportunity's right there in front of me. So I haven't written anything for publication since I retired, but a number of these stories have in fact found publications, because things have come my way and said, you know, have you got something about this? Or maybe this will fit. And I thought, well, yeah, I've already got something done along those lines. One example of that is if you read the story about the Viktor Frankl symbol in the International Forum for Logotherapy. That I didn't write that for the forum. I wrote that for my grandkids. But Rod said we're looking for some items that might be of interest for the forum. And last time we did this presentation, Cindy brought up that particular one to talk about. I said, okay, well, at least Cindy's interested in this. And Rod wants an article. It's already done. Why not? And so that went there. The other article that I already mentioned in the Vienna Journal that's coming out later this year, I didn't write that for the Vienna Journal. Actually, that's 3 different stories that I put together when Charles McLafferty asked about submit something for the journal. And I said, well, yeah, now that I think about it, I have a story that would work well there. It's 3 stories. I'll just condense it into 1 story and give it to you. And he wrote back and said, well, it's certainly not your usual writing style, Bob, because it's in story style. But yeah, we'll take that. And there've been other opportunities for these stories to come up. One of them was the Alumni Association newsletter of my high school. I was talking to a lady about a story that I had written about getting into trouble, holding hands with Vicki in the hallways of the high school when we were in high school. And this lady was the secretary to the principal, whose office we were called into as a result of our misbegotten behaviors. And I mentioned to her this story because she was in it. And at about that time, her son walked into where we were. It was in a restaurant where we had run into each other. And he's a big promoter of our high school. He's also the mayor of the city. And he said, you know, you ought to write that. You ought to send that to the alumni newsletter. So we did. Now, I've done a lot of publishing over my lifetime, which means, you know, I value doing that. I appreciate, enjoy, and value publishing. So this was another way to actualize my value, that particular value, is by publishing it. So that's another one of those individual applications that I apply to myself. So the first one I talked about with keeping the list, I've used with a number of clients well before I retired, but I haven't used this with anyone else or in any kind of a clinical or therapeutic way. Now, the third objective that we set for this meeting was an explanation of a group application of logotherapy, and a practical way to do that. And that one's really easy to do. In fact, Memda and I were talking about that before we came on the air. And for me, that's the MPG's workbook, the Meaningful and Purposeful Goals workbook. Now, in that book, it's an extension of Jim Crumbaugh's logo analysis, which is a paper and pencil exercise oriented process. So you actually write things down. And what it does is takes you through the steps of logotherapy, surfacing the underlying value system, and then moving into assessing your goals to see if they fit with your value system. And if not, adding some new goals to your life that might be missing and not fulfilling some of your values. Now, when I worked with Jim Crumbaugh, this was at a VA hospital in Gulfport, Biloxi, Mississippi, which was where I had my internship. And he said, doing straight logotherapy is really useful for a lot of people, but there are some people that just can't go beyond the surfacing of the values. They just can't make that next step to fit it with their goals. At a certain level of conceptualization and cognitive ability, that just happens. You surface the value and you get it and you know what to do. And that's a lot of the case studies that you see Frankl publishing about. The people just, they get it. It's obvious. Well, he was working in a VA psychiatric hospital with people who had long histories of drug and alcohol abuse. He says, a lot of our guys don't get it. So we have to move beyond surfacing the value system and into assessing how you're going to actualize values in your goals. What are your goals going to be? How do you figure this out? So that was a part of his process, and that's what we incorporated into the MPG's workbook. Now, the workbook came from a group that we did, which was 10 sessions long, and that group then went beyond assessing your goals to fit with your values and putting in new goals that will fit any leftover values. It went on to planning. So we had sessions on how do you plan to reach those goals that fit with your values? Because a lot of our guys couldn't do that. And when I moved from Mississippi to back to our home state of Iowa, I worked on an alcohol treatment program similar to Jim Crumbaugh's program. So I had similar patients in the program I worked on. So my patients, just like his patients, then needed to work on not only surfacing the values, the underlying value system, or doing that part of logotherapy, but also figuring out how do these things fit your goals, because it isn't always automatic for everyone to figure it out. And with my guys, I also found that they really didn't know how to plan. They just didn't have it figured out. So in our group, then we went on to how do you make plans to reach your goals that actualize your values? And then we added a fourth step. And the fourth step was maximizing the probability that you can exercise those plans to reach your goals, to actualize your values. And in that, what we did was we had people take a good look at what their abilities were. What do you have going for you? Now, once you figure that out, let's specifically put it into your plans to make your plans work. And particularly with our guys in alcohol and drug problems, what gets in your way? What are your deficits? What are your problems? Let's not leave the program saying, well, I've got this idea of where I'm headed and I hope it works. Oh, but I've failed each time before because I went out and drank. Okay, you know that's your problem. Let's work on how we're going to fit that into your plans so that you won't as likely have that problem, or so that you will have something to do once you experience that problem again. So now we have figure out what works for you and figure out ways to get around those things that you can put into your plan that, if successful, will actualize will accomplish your goals, that will actualize your underlying value system. So for at one point in time, the VA was kind of spreading us out really thin, was trying to cut staff. We did what we could to continue this group going. It was a group actually on a building that I ended up on. When I moved to Knoxville, I told my boss coming in, there are two things I do not want to do. Number one, I don't want to work in neuropsychology. And number two, I do not want to work on a drug and alcohol program. So, of course, I worked on both the neuropsychology program and the drug and alcohol program. I worked on the drug and alcohol program where they not only did not like psychologists, but they had physically removed the previous psychologist from the building. So I went into a very hostile atmosphere. And I worked for several weeks for them to let me do anything, because all they wanted me to do was go away. It was not a subtle suggestion. They told me, we threw the last one off the unit and we don't want you to be here. And I said, well, just try and throw me off the unit, because I'm here and I'm planning to stay. Just try and throw me off the unit. And the director of the program said, Bob, I've gone to the director and we can't get you thrown off. I said, well, then what I'm planning to do is I'm going to be a thorn in your side until you let me do something. And so eventually I became a big enough thorn in the director's side that they said, okay, you can do something. What do you want to do? I said, well, I'm going to do logotherapy, because I know when I do this, the patients are going to love it. They're going to benefit from it, and that you really won't be able to argue with it. So he said, okay, you can do this logotherapy group. And when I started, he sent the most anti-psychologist staff member he had into the group with the rest of the patients. And this anti-psychologist staff member's task was to keep track of what I was doing and report back to the director and tell him when I did something wrong that could get me thrown out of the program. Well, it's a 2-week group that we were doing. At the end of the first week, this staff member stayed after the group with me. He said, Bob, I want to tell you, I'm reporting back to the director. I said, yeah. He says, I reported back to the director that we need this and we want to keep this. So I stayed with that program for, when I went into it, because I knew I wasn't wanted there, I had an agreement that after 6 months, I would be able to leave that program. At the end of 6 months, it was time for me to leave, and the director called me into his office, and he said, "Bob, you and I don't like each other." I agreed. He says, "We probably never will." I agreed. And he says, "And you're leaving, thank God, but would you consider continuing that logo analysis stuff that you do every day at 3 o'clock, even though you're not going to be working here?" And I did. So we continued it, and we continued it through, I counted one time, we did over 3,000 people through this program that came through logotherapy group, the logo analysis group. But the hospital was trying to cut down the number of psychologists and all mental health staff, and spreading us out thinner and thinner. So we did what we could to keep it going. And finally, we got to the point where it looked like we were not going to be able to continue this and do all the other things we were being requested to do. And one of our interns who came on to our staff, Mary Eggert, said, "We need to write this as a book." And so that's how we eventually wrote this MPG's workbook, which covers the first 2 parts of this logo analysis group that I've just been talking about. So the group itself, if you're interested in finding out more about how to do that, there were several outlines of it published in several places, but one of them is in the International Forum in 1983, in pages 74 through 83. It's called Practical Steps in Logo Analysis. It outlines the whole group from beginning to end. And I believe that's free, isn't it, Rod? Can people just log on and get that?
That's my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. So 1983, it's a publication. I'm the author. It's called Practical Steps in Logo Analysis. And it's in volume 6, page 74 through 83. Also, Franz Vesely, who is Viktor Frankl's son-in-law, is the father of Alex and Katja Vesely, Alex will be, I think, the first session tomorrow, and Vicki and I will be asking him some interview questions and hoping that he's able to talk a lot. Franz Vesely runs the Vienna website, and he has, for many years now, had this workbook that we developed out of this group on the website, and it's free. All you have to do is download the whole workbook, and that's I can give you the location of it. It's on the Viktor Frankl Vienna website. It's a little bit hard to find in there, but most things I find are a little difficult.
I'm going to interrupt you just real quickly. I have that. I give it to all my students. I don't know if it's on our website, but if it's not, we'll get it on there real quick, because I have it. That's what I was looking for. Anyway, I do have it. All my students get it. You shared it with me a while back.
Good.
Cindy sent it to me years ago.
Great. Would be happy to have it on the Institute's website. It's never been on there, but it'd be happy to have it on there. If you go to the Vienna website, you go to www.viktorfrankl.org/assets/PDF/Hutzell. Then the underline, instead of a dash, there's the one at the bottom, the underline, there's one of those. Then it says workbook, underline, 2009, workbook.pdf. So again, if you want to look at that workbook, it's there. You can use that workbook. You can download your own copies, and it doesn't cost you anything. Years ago, when we first developed it, was for sale. One of the many things that we learned in putting that book together and selling it and so on was that unless you write a million seller, you're not going to get rich writing a book. In fact, it's not worth the energy to keep track of any little bit of income and deal with it at the end of the year with your income tax. So we said, let's just give this away and not mess with keeping track and all that other stuff that has to do with income tax. So it's been on there, I think, since 2009. So we had 3 educational objectives. We just did the 3 educational objectives. So if people have any questions, comments, discussion, we're ready for that. And if not, I'm going to start reading you another one of those papers that I've written for my grandkids.
I'm going to say Mimda now has the workbook again. He has it earlier, but he's got it again. So we will get it on the website.
I have it though.
Yes, you have it anyway.
I have it and I've used it. Bob, so, as you know, I have to leave at 3:45 to get ready for my session. So I do want to hear one of these stories. But before, if you go there, you said right at the beginning that one of you smoked cigars. Who was it? Was it you or
Me.
I figured it was Bob. So, I just wanted to throw in a fun little thing there.
Just to clarify from Vicky, she wants to make sure you understand.
I think this is so amazing what you've shared, and this idea of story writing, like I think it would be so meaningful. Like when you actually write stories, like what do you experience? And I know it depends, of course, on the story, but as you're thinking, I want my grandchildren to read this, I mean, when you're done, what do you feel and what do you experience?
Well, I write them with the idea of my value system in mind. And so that's what I experience when I get one done. Now, there are a number of elements to the stories that also actualize my values that aren't directly the stories themselves. So, like I said, we go back to the people who are in the stories and we foster the relationships with them. And some of those people then tell us about their stories. And one of the persons that we send the stories to were they were friends in graduate school. So they were friends in the 1970s. And the man was in English literature department. He was in graduate school. And so he taught then English literature, particularly American literature, as a career. And then he retired and he wrote a couple of novels, I think in the 90s, and hadn't written since then. But they get the stories. So, and they have a great time with the stories, but also, and they're a little older than us, they wrote back, and his name is Jay, her name is Jane. And they wrote back and said, Jay decided that if Bob can write, he can write again. So he's written 3 novels since then. I think he's about 80, but he hadn't written for years. But he's now written 3 novels that we have copies of. So that gives us great satisfaction there that we kind of got him motivated to get back to writing. In one of those stories, I included a recipe that Jane had given us at that point in time when we were in grad school, a recipe that we still use. And there are a number of those kinds of recipes that are written about. But I wrote to Jane and said, would it be okay? Are you okay with me putting this recipe in this story? And she wrote back and said, yeah, absolutely. We were okay with that. And that is Jay's grandma's potato salad recipe. That's that's like a family heirloom, and it was lost. So now they have the recipe. So
Yeah.
those kind of things that fit in with, and additionally, I belong to a couple of writing groups. So with the writing groups, now I have groups of people, one in our local town, which is 5 miles away, and another one in a little bit further away town, which is only 10 miles away. We frequent both towns. These are people I would not have met for the most part ever, have not interacted with. Now I interact with these folks weekly. So we have this meeting these social values and these social activities, so that it just spreads out further and further and further. So again, that's a long answer to your question, which was really, I feel a good positive sense of meaning and purpose because doing this actualizes my underlying value system.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes. Actually, we have 2 more minutes to go.
Okay, we're done at 3:45.
That's what I thought.
Okay.
Nearly
'Cause I could
44.
go on till tomorrow.
Then I would like to thank all the participants. Please do not take the session survey before you leave. And we would like to thank you, one of the pillars of logotherapy, historical pillar of logotherapy.
Well,
Thank
thank
you,
you
Dr.
all
Hutzell.
for being here with us. It's been fun.
Thanks. I'm terminating the call.